As I record this, it is July 3rd, the day before Independence Day, one of the most amazing days in the history of mankind. I know we celebrate July 4th and Independence Day here in America because it was the defining point of when this great nation was created. But I think it goes further than that. There is a reason why America has made it to where it has in only 250 years to become the single greatest nation ever known to man. We are, by and far, the world's lone superpower. It is the place where people from every corner of the globe will risk death just to find our shores and hopefully become citizens of this great nation. It is truly a miracle. It is the greatest experiment ever conducted in the history of mankind. What made America so incredibly unbelievable, unique, and wonderful is that it was the first time ever. First of all, let's start with George Washington. George Washington was the first ever, I'm talking about going back to the Caesars, go back to Napoleon, you just any leader you can think of, any military leader who won a revolution and did not become either a dictator, an emperor, a king, but instead said, I don't want it. They wanted to make George Washington a king, and he said, basically, George Washington was offended at the very notion of even the suggestion of him becoming a king. And then whenever our framers, the framers of the Constitution and the founders of this nation, when they got together, the thing that they did that was the absolute miracle that had never been done before was they decided now that they had their own independent power, that what they would do that was unique was flip the script on all of history and give that power to the people. It was a nation of the people, by the people, for the people. And that is truly unique. And I know a lot of you listening to this, you may, and some of you, look, I don't want to assume that any of you have really dug into your history in a while, but I want us all to just take a minute to kind of stop and think about just how amazing that is. That the power that had been gained in the freedom thanks to the unbelievable decisions and unbelievable treasure and blood that was spent to gain our independence from the British Crown, our founders gave that power back to the people. And the only constraint that they put upon themselves was on the government, not the people. You see, if you've ever wondered why there's no other nations that talk about a constitution, I mean, you probably heard in Great Britain about the Magna Carta, and then you have all these other documents of confederation and different defining documents for other governments. But there's never been a more powerful document, and there's never been a more limiting to the government that would be the infrastructure for a nation like our Constitution. Our Constitution lays out what the government is and is not allowed to do to its citizens or on behalf of its citizens. The Constitution, it embodies the chains that bind our government so that we are never to be servants of a government, a monarchy, or a power other than the power always rests with us. And that is an absolute miracle. Now, I also think it's genius to think that here we are 250 years later and thinking about the brilliance of our founders. Now, these were men that were mostly scholars. They were very young, first of all. I think the average age of the founders were like 36. That's off the top of my head. I mean, they were really young. Of course, people died much younger back then. But they were brilliant for their age, and they had studied the texts of ancient philosophers, the Stoics, of Aristotle, of Plato. They had looked at all the Greek and Roman history to try to figure out how do we do this thing better. Thomas Jefferson was just infatuated with the French and their thirst for liberty and freedom. Now, the French Revolution was something completely different than what the revolution that we would end up having here in America. And then also the brilliance of it, I think, came from the fact that our freedom from the British Crown was won by everyday, ordinary people. True, John Adams, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, many of these, John Hancock, many of the founders were educated, were wealthy merchants. They were as close as you could get to aristocracy of their time. But the actual men and women that took the stand to fight and form the militias and join in the Continental Army, this ragtag group of soldiers that George Washington had to lead, that were often walking through below freezing temperatures, almost barefooted because their shoes had been worn out, battling frostbite, half starved, sick. These were ordinary, everyday individuals. These were farmers. These were blacksmiths. They were men that worked with their hands, and they were able to defeat what was at that time the greatest empire on the face of the earth. It's truly remarkable. And then there's something else. There's something I think that in modern day society that a lot of us have lost, and that's the idea of virtue and honor, of being willing to sacrifice oneself for something much, much greater than ourselves. To be able to put aside our own financial comfort, our own health, well-being, and even that of our families in order to achieve something far greater. And that's what I think every single signer of the Declaration of Independence was willing to do. These were men that knew surely, as Benjamin Franklin said, we must all hang together or we will all hang individually. He knew this, they all knew, and I guarantee you, you got the largest signature on the Declaration, which is that of John Hancock. But I think even probably John Hancock and all these signers, I bet their pen was trembling. I bet that quill, that feathered quill that they were using to sign that document was probably, their hands were probably shaking as they signed it. And look, this is going to sound like a great overstatement, and it is, but it's almost like our founders were kind of like Jesus in the garden. Whenever Jesus was like, Father God, please take this cup from me, but not mine, but your will be done. What Jesus knew, because Jesus felt all of humanity. He was a man of flesh and blood. And he knew the torture that he was about to have to endure. But he also knew that it was absolutely necessary so that we may be able to spend eternity with God and with Christ in heaven one day. He knew that had to be done. That was how the scriptures had to be fulfilled. So therefore, Jesus went to the cross. Now, none of these men were crucified, but many of them suffered immensely, and they knew the stakes. They knew that this was a possibility, and they still went forward. Now, I want to read this document that tells you exactly what happened to the signers of the Declaration of Independence, because this, to me, shows you that this wasn't just some haughty, aristocratic, guys that just were protected from this decision, that it was just, this is something that we decided. It's just kind of an administrative act that we've done. No, it was much, much heavier than that. 5 signers were captured by the British as traitors and tortured before they died. 12 had their homes ransacked and burned. 2 lost their sons in the Revolutionary Army. Another had 2 sons captured. 9 of the 56 fought and died from wounds or the hardships of the Revolutionary War. What kind of men were they? 24 were lawyers and jurists, 11 were merchants, 9 were farmers and large plantation owners, men of means, well-educated. But they signed the Declaration of Independence knowing full well that the penalty would be death if they were captured. They signed and they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Carter Braxton of Virginia, a wealthy planter and trader, saw his ships swept from the seas by the British Navy. He sold his home and properties to pay his debts and died in rags. Thomas McKean was so hounded by the British that he was forced to move his family almost constantly. He served in the Congress without pay, and his family was kept in hiding. His possessions were taken from him, and poverty was his reward. Vandals or soldiers or both looted the properties of Ellery, Clymer, Hall, Walton, Gwinnett, Hayward, Rutledge, and Middleton. At the Battle of Yorktown, Thomas Nelson Jr. noted that the British General Cornwallis had taken over the Nelson home for his headquarters. The owner quietly urged General George Washington to open fire, which was done. The home was destroyed, and Nelson died bankrupt. Francis Lewis had his home and properties destroyed. The enemy jailed his wife, and she died within a few months. John Hart was driven from his wife's bedside as she was dying. Their 13 children fled for their lives. His fields and his gristmill were laid waste. For more than a year, he lived in forests and caves, returning home after the war to find his wife dead, his children vanished. A few weeks later, he died from exhaustion and a broken heart. Norris and Livingston suffered similar fates. Such were the stories and sacrifices of the American Revolution. These were not wild-eyed, rabble-rousing ruffians. They were soft-spoken men of means and education. They had security, but they valued liberty more. Standing tall, straight, and unwavering, they pledged for the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of the divine providence. We mutually pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They gave us an independent America. Now, I ask you this, folks, can we keep it? I used to hear the quote by Ronald Reagan in which he said that freedom and liberty are not passed through the bloodstream, but they are fought for each and every generation. I'm paraphrasing. And I think we're at a time where we're truly, these things are being brought to bear, these questions. Was this amazing experiment that led to the greatest freedom, the greatest wealth creation, the greatest superpower ever known to man? Was it worth it? Was it right? I certainly think so. But we have people like, for example, Zoran Mamdani in New York, who thinks that this was all done in a very dark way. There are people within our own Congress that absolutely despise everything that has happened over the last 250 years. They consider this an illegitimate endeavor, an experiment gone bad, and yet none of them can point to any place on earth they would rather be. I think that's worth noting. Also, when you think about our revolution and how amazing it is, there are many, many other nations right now that oppress their people. They do not live with the freedoms we have. They are jailed, tortured, even killed for some of their beliefs. Women are treated as second-class citizens. Slavery still exists to this day in parts of the world. Yet what is the biggest move that most of these folks make? It's not a revolution. They try to escape to America. And I don't blame them. I don't blame them. But whenever you think of what our founders did, they didn't point to another nation and say, it's your fault that our citizens have problems. You should take them in and you should let them benefit from your resources. Instead, our founders said, nope, we're going to stay right here. And we're going to create a new nation, a new kind of nation, a more perfect union. And that more perfect union, more perfect, not perfect, it will never be perfect. But we have to also remember it was founded by fallible human beings. America, the idea, America, the nation, the government we currently have, it's not just some abstract thing. It's easy to say the government, America. No, it's all of us. Fallible, sinful, prideful, selfish, greedy human beings with a lot of flaws. But nowhere on planet Earth is there anywhere with all those flaws, with all those shortcomings, that we get to live with such freedom, security, and prosperity as this great nation of ours. I thank you so much for listening to the Jason Wright Show, those of you who do. If you think someone would benefit from this, please pass it along. And I don't care if you're on the left. I don't care if you're on the right. I don't care if you're a member of the what seems to be becoming the new Democratic Party, which is the Democratic Socialists of America that essentially despise every single thing this country stands for. I don't care who you are. I pray that God richly blesses you, your family, and to those who have made the ultimate sacrifice, let us all remember them on this day, all the way back from the Revolution forward. For the families left behind from our soldiers that made that ultimate sacrifice, thank you. Thank you for the sacrifice you gave. Thank you so much. And to my fellow Americans, may God richly, richly bless you. Have a blessed and happy Independence Day.